The Kingdom of Sodor is a wonderful place. It is home to many different railways and road vehicles too. There are narrow gauge engines that work up in the hills. There are engines smaller than the narrow gauge engines that usually collect ballast. There are engines that specialize in taking passengers up to the top of the mountains to see the sights that lay up there. And there are also standard gauge engines that are the biggest size of engines on the Kingdom of Sodor tracks. There are many engines that work on the standard gauge railway, steam engines and diesel engines. One day, a red standard gauge tender engine named James brought a long train of stone trucks to the quarry where the narrow gauge engines and standard gauge engines worked. It had been a rough journey though. James waited for the turntable to spin so he could move forward and then shunt his trucks into a siding. A grumpy steamroller named George waited impatiently at the crossing for James to clear the way. Come on, said George impatiently. I don't have all day. You don't even have any work to do, said Mighty, one half of a double ferry narrow gauge engine. And it's easy to see why, said Mac, the other half. James shunted the trucks into the siding and bumped them hard against the bumpers. Ow, said the trucks in the brake van. Yeah, that's right, you better say ow, said James. Serves you right for holding me back the whole way here. I'm just lucky I left early, so that I wouldn't risk running late in case you played any of your stupid tricks on me. The trucks just giggled as James was uncoupled. James was exhausted and went over to the turntable to get a rest. The turntable turned to an empty siding. James was about to back up, but Mighty stopped him. Hold up there, James, he said. You can't go onto that siding. That's right, said Mac. That's a narrow gauge siding. If you look closely, you'll notice the rails are too small for you. James was cross. What's the point in having a dual gauge track turntable if I can't move onto any of these sidings to rest? I don't know, said Mighty. That's just the way these tracks were designed and planned out. This made James very cross. What's the point of having you narrow gauge engines around as well as the other railways that aren't standard gauge? We standard gauge engines can handle all the work that you guys do. We don't need you guys around. This made the narrow gauge engines cross. Impudent scallywag, said Duke crossly. We may be small and not quite as busy as you engines usually are, but we can make tighter turns and work better up in the mountains compared to you guys. That's right, said Rusty. We all have a use here in the Kingdom of Sodor. Puh, said George. That's a good one. If James thinks that you little engines are not of any use, then they should tear up your rails and replace them with some roads. You stay out of this, George, shouted Sir Handel. This doesn't involve you. George laughed. Why don't you use your special steamroller wheels to come over and tell that to my face? Just then, two cargo trucks pulled up and honked at George. He was blocking their way to the crossing. George growled and stormed away. The engines breathed a sigh of relief as George left. I don't get why he has to be so grumpy, said Luke. No one likes a grumpy vehicle. He gives steam-driven vehicles a bad name with that attitude of his. Well, sooner or later, someone's gonna have to straighten him out, said Rusty. I agree, said Mighty. Yeah, said Sir Handel. Hopefully before the new engine gets finished. James had begun to puff away, but he stopped. New engine? What new engine? He asked. Have you not been at the steamworks for the last couple weeks? Asked Mac. Apparently not, said Mighty. Otherwise he'd be bragging about a new coat of paint he just received. Luke and Sir Handel giggled. Ha ha, said James, but seriously, what's this about a new engine? Well, said Scarloey, a new engine is at the steamworks, being built from scratch, unlike other engines that just come to the kingdom from other railways. Really? Said a very interested James. I'll have to go there soon and see what this is all about. I have to deliver some parts to the steamworks, said Paxton, so I'll get to see the engine being built when I go there. I could do it for you, said James. I thought you wanted a rest, chuckled Paxton, and he rolled away. James rolled his eyes and went into Paxton's siding to get some rest.
I'm on the edge of surreality, but I know everything is gonna be cool as long as you're here with me. And we're gonna lighten up each other's load when bumps and curves come on the road, 'cause we are all in it together, and that's forever. It's always summer in Bikini Bottom. Even in December, we're singing la-di-da-da. It's always summer in Bikini Bottom. In Bikini Bottom. It doesn't get better than that. We found our way through trial and error. It doesn't matter how long it takes, as long as we get there. And now I know how much I need you here. I'm never gonna let you disappear. Love is the glue that holds us together, and that's forever. It's always summer in Bikini Bottom. Even in December, we're singing la-di-da-da. It's always summer in Bikini Bottom. In Bikini Bottom. It doesn't get better than 'cause I was made for you, and you were made for me. We keep each other warm, we're on each other's team. I finally appreciate the things you say to keep me straight. I don't know what I'd do without you. SpongeBob. It's always summer in Bikini Bottom. Even in December, we're singing la-di-da-da. It's always summer in Bikini Bottom. In Bikini Bottom. It doesn't get better than that. Oh yeah. It's always summer. Oh yeah. In Bikini Bottom.
Yes, the kingdom of Sodor is a marvelous place to be. In fact, one might say it's rather magical. Later that day, Paxton had to stop near a crossing so that a bus named Bertie could go over the track. Thomas also had to wait on the adjacent line for Bertie to pass over the tracks. Thomas was the #1 engine on the Sodor Kingdom Railway. He wore his number with pride and felt like he was one of the best engines around, though he didn't brag about it. "Hello, Thomas," said Bertie. "Care for a race today?" "Sorry, Bertie, I'm going in the other direction," said Thomas. "Maybe another time." Once Bertie had crossed over the track, Thomas started to leave. He noticed Paxton getting ready to leave as well. "Hello, Paxton," said Thomas. "Did you see that new engine at the steamworks yet?" "Yes, I have," said Paxton. "He's coming along quite nicely. And he's going to be a narrow gauge engine too." "I see," said Thomas. "That's pretty interesting." "I guess it would make sense though," said Thomas. "A standard gauge engine being built from scratch would take much longer and a lot more work." "What's this about an engine being built?" asked Salty. "Oh, hello, Salty," said Thomas. "Have you heard about the new engine being built at the steamworks?" "Yes, I have," said Salty. "But I don't know what gauge it's going to be, or what type of engine it is, either. It's a narrow gauge engine, Paxton told me," said Thomas. "Ah, a narrow gauge engine? We could use a few more of those on this railway, if I'm being honest," said Salty. "I can't argue with that," said Thomas. He uncoupled from his candy cars and went to do his next job. Later that evening, Thomas was pleased when he was sent to collect the workmen from the steamworks and take them home. This meant he could get a peek at the new narrow gauge engine. As Thomas waited for the workmen to board his coaches, he looked at the small narrow gauge engine sitting on a hoist. Thomas could tell just by looking at it that the engine had a lot of potential. "This engine will go far," Thomas said to himself. "I just know it." Thomas knew that the engine wasn't entirely finished yet. But as he began to leave with the workmen, he stopped next to it and whispered, "Welcome to Sodor." Then he puffed out of the steamworks with his two coaches, Annie and Clarabelle. Oh, careful, Kevin." "Sorry, boss, but there was barely enough room for me to squeeze between that coal car and the crane." "Did you ever think of driving around the coal car?" "Oh, no, that never occurred to me. I'll try it next time." Victor sighed, not because Kevin hadn't thought to drive around the coal car, but because he was a little bored just working on the new narrow gauge engine for the past several days. "It is nice to be helping to make a new engine, particularly one that runs on my gauge of rails," Victor said to himself, "but I wish I could have some other engines to work on. Some repairs, a tune-up, even a new coat of paint. I would just like to have some extra company at the steamworks." Little did Victor know how soon his wish would be granted. The next day, Donald and Douglas, the Scottish twins, were waiting impatiently at Crovansgate Station for Sir Handel, the narrow gauge engine, to bring his passengers. Eventually, Sir Handel made it to the station, grumbling dreadfully. "There you are," said Douglas. "What took you so long?" asked Donald. "Some sheep strayed onto the track," said Sir Handel crossly. "And it took that long to get them out of your way?" asked Donald. "No, it didn't take that long. What took even longer was getting me back on the tracks." "You ran into them?" No. I stopped just in time, but it gave the coaches a bump. The stupid things thought I bumped them on purpose, so they bumped me back and I derailed." "Don't you go calling us stupid," said one of the coaches crossly. "Oh," said Douglas, "so the dumb things jumped to conclusions, did they?" "Yes," said Sir Handel, "and it's not the first time they've done that either." The coaches were very annoyed. "Well, maybe we wouldn't treat you this way if you hadn't called us cattle cars on your first day here," said one of the coaches. "I was a young and foolish engine back then," said Sir Handel. "I've gotten older and matured now, but it seems you lot have not." "Yeah," said Donald. "Any young and experienced engine would have called you cattle cars." "No, only this blockhead. Hey!" As the passengers exited the coaches and went on to Donald and Douglas' train, they began complaining to the coaches. "You already gave us an earful when we derailed Sir Handel. We don't need another one on the same day," said a coach crossly. "Get on board that train and be off." "Now looky here, you miserable lot," said Donald crossly. "Bumping is the troublesome truck's job, not yours. If you coaches can't learn to behave and make amends with Sir Handel, I'll have you placed on a dual-gauge truck so I can bash you off the rails so hard you get amnesia." "Ugh!" groaned the coaches. "Take us back to the shed at once," they shouted at Sir Handel. "With displeasure," Sir Handel said quietly as he pulled the coaches away. Douglas was concerned. "You needn't say such harsh threats, Donny," he said. "If the passengers heard you say that, they would have complained for sure, and that would have given this railway a bad name." "Well, you can't expect me to talk nice to a troublemaker," said Donald. "I understand that," said Douglas. Just then the station master came out of Crovan's Gate station. "Henry passed through with only half of the goods train he was pulling," he said. "I noticed he didn't have a brake van," said Douglas. "Will one of you please go fetch the rest of his train and bring it to Vicarstown? Henry can't go back or he'll be late." "Can you do it, Douglas?" asked Donald. "I'm at the back here, and I've got the passengers to deliver." "All right," said Douglas. "I'll do it." So Douglas uncoupled from Donald, went down the line, turned around, switched onto the other track, and went to go get the rest of Henry's train. Douglas soon found the truck sitting on the track. They were giggling to each other. The brake van at the back of the train was the spiteful brake van that James had been pulling the other day. He had made the trucks hold back, which had caused the coupling to break. "You stupid things," said Douglas, and he bumped the trucks hard. Douglas had bumped the truck so hard that the brake van's brakes had slipped on and were now stuck. Douglas was coupled up, blew his whistle, and began to puff away, but he heard a loud, horrible screeching noise. The brake van's brakes were stuck and its wheels were dragging along, sending sparks. "Ouch, ouch," said the brake van. "Stop, stop." But Douglas didn't stop. Then, when the train came to the bumps, the brake van suddenly tipped over and hit an old tree. The tree was knocked over and the brake van then tipped the other way. He hit a sign and another tree. "Ow, ow," he cried. Then, as Douglas rounded the bend, the coupling snapped and the brake van was left on the side of the track in a field. He was badly damaged and all four of his wheels had gone flat from being dragged with his brakes on. He was very cross indeed. Douglas finished his journey without the brake van, but felt embarrassed when he puffed through Crovan's Gate. "Douglas, where's your brake van?" asked Garlowy. "I don't want to talk about it," said Douglas as he went by. The spiteful brake van was soon rescued and was taken away to the works to be mended.